Okay. We are here today with Joan McCord, Professor of Criminal Justice at Temple University. Professor McCord has had a long and distinguished career in criminology, especially concerning the study of the causes of antisocial behavior, crime, and violence. Professor McCord is probably best known for her follow-up studies of the subjects in the Cambridge Somerville Youth Study. Among her many awards and honors, Professor McCord was given the Edwin Sutherland Award from the American Society of Criminology in 1994 for her outstanding contributions to criminology. For the record, I should say that we are meeting today, November 21st, 1996, in Chicago, Illinois, at the annual meeting of the American Society of Criminology for the Oral Histories Archives Project. Joan, I'd like to start by asking you, how did you get involved in the field of criminology?
There are a lot of different ways you could answer that question, and since both of us deal with autobiographical histories, I'm hesitant to give you a single answer. Okay. But one possible and one explanation is the fact that I was working at Wiltwyck in 1953, and that was a school for the treatment of juvenile delinquents. And there were kids there who were murderers, who had been exceedingly violent, and yet who on a one-to-one contact seemed personable, intelligent, and unlikely to commit the crimes that I knew from the records they had in fact committed. And it piqued my curiosity.
At what point, and from there, how did that influence your career in terms of education? What was the career path that led you to?
During the next year, I was a research assistant for Eleanor Maccabee, who was doing work on socialization and particularly interested in what made children aggressive. She gave me as my first project a review of the criminological literature to try to understand that in terms of socialization history.
I see.
And once starting in reading and seeing the many questions, it's hard to resist a good field.
Well, let me just for the record, that you ended up getting, when you worked with Eleanor Maccabee, that was at Harvard University?
Yes.
Okay, so you received your degree in 1956 at Harvard.
Well, I have a very checkered educational career.
I understand. Well,
I got my PhD from Stanford in 1968.
Earlier. Okay, later than that. Okay.
And that was in sociology.
Okay.
So I've had some education in psychology, and then I was a student at Harvard in philosophy.
I see. Okay.
And at Stanford in philosophy as well, and then moved to sociology.
Okay. I see. So you've looked at, so from those various disciplines, though, was there a question or theme that you felt connected them for you?
Very, very much so.
Yeah, what was that?
What makes for intentional action? What makes people choose to do certain kinds of things in a field in which we know that we can do pretty good work with predictions? So it's the question of choice, really, Aristotle's question.
I see. Do you think there's anything in your personal background, how you grew up, childhood, adolescent experience, that influenced that intellectual interest of yours?
Possibly, because I grew up in a fairly lower class family and had a boyfriend who was fairly upper class. And so nothing could be accepted as given.
I see.
Because when you ate your meals, what you did with your meals, how you talked to one another, whether you should laugh when somebody says something funny, all were subject to questions as teenagers. So
I see. Interesting. So that could have very well had an influence.
At least to the extent of having to face up to questions about action that I think most people never really ask.
I want to make sure I pronounce it right, is it Wiltwyck? The reform school?
Yes.
Yes. Wiltwyck experience, was that your first encounter with crime, would you say?
No,
I'm not asking for a self-report necessarily, but in terms of a professional capacity?
Oh, yes. But I hung around with a lot of kids who like to break rules.
I see. And what part of the country did you grow up in?
Tucson, Arizona.
Tucson, Arizona, yeah. Well, for the students that are going to be viewing the videotape, we should point out that Wiltwyck is a famous school.
Oh, yes.
And Claude Brown, the author of Man-Child, the Promised Land, was one of the residents there at one point in his life. And,
that's right, just before I was there.
Yes, so I think that it's, and it still, I believe, is in existence.
The school and its name are still, but it's not run the same way anymore.
That's right, that's right. So, well, that's important for our students to know about that history in terms of the field. What I'd like to do is, if we could, discuss some of your major contributions. As I said, I think that you have a very long and distinguished career in criminology, but for me, as a student of your work, and I think for many people, you're most identified with the follow-up studies of the Cambridge-Somerville youth study. Is that a fair assessment?
That certainly is fair.
Could you talk, I guess, about what that study was and how you came to get involved in that?
The study was an experimental study trying to figure out how to intervene in the lives of people who were likely to commit crimes. A man named Dr. Cabot, who was a professor at Harvard, realized that you had to have random assignment and an evaluation with clear measures to detect whether or not an intervention program was in fact effective. And the program began in 1939, continued till 1945, with parts of it continuing until 1948. The original follow-up showed that it was ineffective, but Gordon Allport, who also was a psychologist at Harvard, believed that if you went back and looked, you'd find long-term effects. That meant 1954, which is short-term compared to now.
Right.
And I was employed for the summer to follow up and see whether it had further effects. From that early work came the book called Origins of Crime. But we also in 1959 didn't find long-term effects. And so I returned again in the 1970s, which was long-term effects. And during the period of the 1950s when I was a graduate student, I had walked into a room that was filled with records. This was while I was Eleanor Maccabee's research assistant. Eleanor Maccabee's study was asking mothers to report on how they treated their children and how their children behaved. She also had some doll play situations where you could watch the children, and I was coding those, and thought that it was a shame to believe what mothers had to say about what they did when you can't be objective about your own behavior. During the summer when I saw the records and saw that social workers had recorded what they saw, it occurred to me that it was a marvelous opportunity to be able to find out what a third person thought was going on in the families of these 500 Cambridge-Somerville youth study people. So I applied for a grant as a graduate student, and the coding was done in the 1950s.
I see. And that did culminate in the publication Origins of Crime, which was written with William McCord and yourself.
No, this is. I'm sorry, my my checkered career doesn't come through quite that clearly. Origins of Crime was written based on studying the glukes. And therefore, all the coding is in the gluck code situation, the material that you use in your study. And my ex-husband, William McCord, had been a student of the glucks. So we used those codes for the original Origins of Crime. During the summer when I was Eleanor Maccabee's student, I was learning a lot about methodology, and I used Eleanor Maccabee's codes, hired new research assistants. We went back to the records, recoded using the clean, descriptive material that the Maccabees had. It's Sears, Maccabee, and Levin had.
The patterns of child rearing study,
That's correct.
which is the well-known study in psychology.
That's right.
So that was an important influence in terms of thinking.
Absolutely.
Because one of the things I think we're trying to document is what are the sources of ideas that people use within their intellectual development.
And this was extremely important because the Sears, Maccabee, and Levy advance was to say, let's remove the judgmental quality to what we're coding. Let's be sure to have clear descriptive categories for whatever it is we look at. And so my later work is based on these clear descriptive categories, whereas the earlier was based on the evaluative.
When you say the later work, could you just frame that in time so we understand the...
Yes, that's a good idea. 1960 is later.
Okay, so after Origins of Crime. So Origins of Crime was in effect taking the existing codes from the original...
No, two different times. There was no coding. The Cambridge-Somerville Youth Study comes in really straight files that are typewritten, tissue paper thin files about this thick. for each person. Every time a counselor had encountered anybody in the family,
I see.
anybody related to a case, it got dictated into the files.
I see.
Nobody had coded them before.
I see. And you were the first.
We were the first.
I see.
And we coded them twice.
Uh-huh.
Once I coded them along with other researchers in the Gluck way.
Right.
Second time in the Maccabee way.
I
And that's
see.
the one I've been using
I
ever
see.
since.
Okay, all right. I think one of the findings that has come out of that, and you've indeed replicated the lack of a beneficial effect of the treatment now over the long term. And I think that's a rather striking finding. Are you surprised by that? I mean, because we hear a lot of research arguing that there's no effect, but the fact that there is a potential for a negative effect
Was the dramatic thing.
was the dramatic thing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It was so surprising that I began from scratch a second time because almost no one had ever discussed the possibility that intervention where you're going to a family and you're offering help, where you're sending children to summer camp, you're taking them to doctors, you're bringing food by, you're providing counseling of all sorts, you're befriending children, that there's any potential for a harmful effect. I reanalyzed from the beginning, having gone through pages of printouts, and it had sort of passed over my head until I suddenly said, everything is going the wrong direction. Reanalysis showed it in fact was negative, and the National Academy of Sciences examined the work and confirmed it. And it made enough of an impression so that I think for a very short time, people were willing to do random assignment to check on the possibility that maybe programs that intervened were iatrogenic.
Right. You actually have been a real supporter of the need for more experiments in the field of criminology. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because it seems to build on this early experience in your intellectual career. Do you see, are you more hopeful about the possibilities for experiments now in criminology?
Yes, I think there are a number of people who have demonstrated that you can do experiments in the courts, that you can do experiments in the way in which children are treated when they're sent to some kind of reform schools, and there are lots of ways that we can do experiments to change socialization. For example, it's possible to experimentally identify, that means randomly identify, families to train in the use of non-punishment and techniques for using clear directions for how children ought to behave. We can do a lot more experimenting if we understand that we know less than we thought we knew.
Right. I see. That's an interesting statement. Also, just by raising the question about practices of punishment by parents, it seems that much of your work is focused on the family.
Yes.
And what is it about the family, in your view, that lends itself to such a prominent role in the study of crime causation?
There really are two reasons for my focus on family. One of them is the one you're suggesting. The second one is the fact that the Cambridge-Somerville Youth Study has the best records on family that you can get, because over a 5.5-year period, a social worker was going in, actually usually 2 social workers, so you have more than one perspective, walking into a home, recording what was happening, who was talking to whom, who was shouting. They were so widely accepted that all kinds of behavior are recorded in the records that you simply don't get by a very short picture of the family at the dining room table, certainly don't get by interviewing either the parents or the children, because it was possible to continue with the records and to see quite validly what was happening in the family. The second reason is, at least in our society, everybody, to my knowledge, believes they have a family. And because even if your family has deserted you, you have expectations about them. That places the family at the core of all sorts of things that come out of it, either the disappointment you feel in your family or the pleasure you feel. It's a way of generating who you are, in my opinion.
Would that be independent of dramatic changes we've seen in family life over the last 50 years? In the sense, I'm just thinking about whether or not, do you think family has the same power today than it did in the 1930s and 1940s? And I guess this is getting at a larger question that one often hears about what could we learn about families from the 1930s and 40s and 50s that's relevant for the 1990s?
I would be very surprised if what was happening in the 1930s is not a model for what happens if you describe it in the right way currently. However, I think obviously television has an impact now and didn't have then. On the other hand, if you're dividing the world up into family, non-family, the family still has an influence on the degree to which television is watched, on what happens as a follow-up to watching television.
I see.
And back in the 30s, there were movies, there were all sorts of athletic things, all kinds of...
A lot of concerns about comic books, I
seem
to recall. So
yeah. there were non-family concerns then, too, over which families could have some kind of control.
So I guess to ask the question pointedly, you do not feel that the work that you've done on the Cambridge-Somerville youth study and the subsequent follow-ups are merely a historical footnote to the study of crime. You see them as more central to understanding processes of crime.
It's such a good question, and I think we always have to ask whether or not whatever we discover at one time will be applicable to another time. David Farrington initiated a study in London on the model of the Cambridge-Somerville examination, has many of the same variables collected in a different culture at a different period of time. Every time we try to replicate, we find awfully similar material. And I've been doing some replication with other people, too, from time to time with more current samples. At least for many of the variables, we seem to be finding the same thing across time and across locations.
That's a very powerful finding in that regard. Could you also talk for our audience a bit, and particularly the students in our audience, about why longitudinal data are important for the study of crime?
In order to be, this is a question I get asked very often. It seems to me that if we're interested in having any knowledge at all about causality, we have to get time sequences correct. And that can be very difficult if you're asking people to recall what happened earlier, because the situation we're in at the current time affects what we remember from the past. So if we have what we regard as a pretty good life now, we're much more likely to remember nice things. And this has been experimentally demonstrated. The retrospective bias is terribly dangerous when you're trying to understand causality, because you don't know whether the reason you remember something bad is that things are happening bad now.
That's right.
Furthermore, we don't know without longitudinal studies what sorts of things can affect your behavior. We have hypotheses, and they get built into our questions when we ask retrospectively, because we don't ask somebody whether the fact that they won a tennis match is responsible for their being in prison. We ask them whether they were beaten is responsible.
Right. I see. So you see it as a central piece of pushing criminology in a scientific direction.
That's correct.
Because it gets at the causality issue.
Yes.
Would